Hey, this is Kira. I'm a bass player, and you may have heard me during Black Flag or Dose or from a new solo record, which is on Kitten Robot Records. So you're listening to The Vinyl Guide.
Oh, well, hey everyone, it's Nate. Welcome to episode 304 of The Vinyl Guide, the podcast for record collectors and music nerds. And yes, we have on the show today Kira Roessler, who you may know from her time in Black Flag, DOS, or even Twisted Roots. However, what you may not know is Kira has her first ever solo album available October 19th, but you can pre-order now at kittenrobot.com. It's not even on vinyl yet, and we talk about that today. There is the CD available, and hopefully we'll see a vinyl release shortly. She and I have a big chat today about this solo album, the early records of her career. We spend a lot of time talking Black Flag history, tales from the tours, the recording of some of their seminal albums, and more. And hey, did you know we have a Patreon page? It's at patreon.com/vinylguide. It's a bit of our virtual tip jar. If you enjoy this podcast and want to support us and help keep it going, go to patreon.com/vinylguide. I always throw extra stuff up there, early episodes, extended interviews, secret episodes, and more. That's patreon.com/vinylguide, and we thank you in advance for your support. Oh, and if you like this episode, make sure to check out some of our other interviews on the Vinyl Guide podcast. Heaps of conversations with Kira's Black Flag colleagues, including Chuck Dukowski, episode 145 of the Vinyl Guide, Spot, the producer and engineer of many SST releases, episode 196 of the Vinyl Guide, Billy Stevenson of Descendants, All and Black Flag, episode 118 of the Vinyl Guide, Mr. Keith Morris, several episodes including the latest, number 290 of the Vinyl Guide, and of course Henry Rollins, episode 100 of the Vinyl Guide, and many, many more. Enjoy these conversations and hundreds others that aren't Black Flag related by following the Vinyl Guide podcast on your podcast app. So without further delay, let's talk to Kira Roessler about her new solo LP and her astounding career. Hello!
Well, hello! Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. You're early. I went to log on, get everything ready. I'm like, oh, my goodness.
You don't have to be ready.
Anyway, great to see you. Thanks for coming on the show. This podcast is about records. It's about collecting. It's about music nerdery stuff. So there's a lot to cover there. But first off, do you have a record collection?
These days, I have more of a digital record collection. I am because I think it's partially because I do sound editing for a living, and I'm sort of listening to stuff a great deal of the day. I'm not as heavy of a music listener as I once was. I have my favorites. If you looked on my phone at any given time, there's a very eclectic set of things that I might reach to at any time for a pick me up or a pull me down, depending on my mood. Mm-hmm. But I don't have a huge vinyl collection. I have a few things left. I have a few CDs left, but I don't really have a player. I've noticed that computers these days don't just let you slip a CD in, so definitely have a larger digital collection, so that I can listen on the phone, on my fancy earbuds, or in the car, or wherever I happen to be,
Okay.
Which is, at home a lot, but not always.
So I guess if your job is in sound and having to listen, it's probably not one of the things you want to do when you get home and get your own time.
It's true. And of course, when I do want to sit down, I am often in, trying to make time for playing my bass guitar and doing my own music. So if you take the work chunk of time and you take my own music chunk of time, it doesn't leave that much left over for just listening casually. That's why I say, in the car or when I'm taking my walk and I'm listening on the phone, those are my opportunities. Right.
So let's go back a ways. Looking at your vinyl history, I believe it started with Twisted Roots. Is that correct? Your first time on record?
I think that sounds about right. A single that Twisted Roots released in my teens called Pretend You What.
Okay, I was wondering what that pronunciation was. Pretend You What?
Pretend You What, which was a Twisted Roots song that I got to have a pretty exciting little bass experiment on. Twisted Roots was a great opportunity on bass. It's interesting. My theories on playing with others and collaboration, it does. I very much try to do what's right for that music, so there are times when I get to, explore a little more wild stuff. And there's times when I feel the important thing is to support the structure and allow others to do more wild experimentation. But on that song in particular, I got to get pretty wild on bass.
Was it always bass for you? Did you begin at bass and that's always been
I began at 6 years old on piano. My brother and I studied classical piano for 5 years, and then I'm a super competitive person. So I quit out of frustration of not being able to keep up with my older brother in classical piano. So for a few years I didn't play, and then at 14, my brother had this progressive rock band that lost their bass player, and the light finally went on. Well, if I played a different instrument, I could play with him instead of compete with him. So I started practicing really hard on the bass guitar, and of course was never good enough to join that progressive rock band. And Paul got into punk rock, luckily. So the skill set required wasn't quite as elaborate, and he and I had our first band, Wax, WAXX, where he played drums, and a great friend of mine, guitar player Glenn Brown, played guitar. He who currently plays on my record now. We've known each other I've known him since elementary school. He's a friend of my brother's. So our first gig was at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Hollywood when I was 16. So we started playing more in bands together, and we did that, and later Twisted Roots.
Okay, so going to these punk shows very young, what were your parents doing at that time? Were they, what was their reaction to this lifestyle you guys were getting caught up into?
Very good question. Well, I think things might have been quite different, except for the fact that my mom moved away when I was 15, and not so much through her choice. I basically demanded that I be allowed to stay in LA. My brother was 18 at the time, and I said, "Look, I'll go to school. I'll be good, but let me stay." I didn't want to move to the Florida Keys where she was moving, which is sort of nowhere land compared to LA, to a teenager.
It's hard to keep them on the farm once they've seen Paris. Yeah.
So exactly. So basically, I was under somewhat of a trial run, as long as my brother was, felt that, I wasn't a burden to him. I was allowed to stay. And so, good or bad, time told, we were on our own quite young. And so by the time I was into punk rock, it was, we were living at this crash pad in Van Nuys, which is not the greatest neighborhood of Los Angeles. I was going to Van Nuys High, and we were going to punk rock shows, and drinking and all of that in a manner that would probably not have been very acceptable to my parents had they known the gory details. But I did have this very strong reason to go to school and get good grades, and sort of keep the facade going that I was a good kid, so that I wouldn't be forced to move to the Florida Keys.
Okay, so that was the condition. So you guys were doing what you wanted, but a bit feral, but still holding up your responsibilities.
I was anyway. Yeah, I mean, look, I've always been a little bit of a goody two shoes. To be fair, I found what I learned early was that if you make the outside look under control, you get left alone, and they don't pay attention to the part of you where you're misbehaving, right? Because you're getting the good grades, or because you're going to school and stuff. So I didn't ditch school a lot and didn't do those things. And because of that, there was no big attention paid to me and my misdeeds, because, oh, well, she's fine. She's getting good grades and she's going to school. So I found it very early that it's a good way to stay out of people's, eyesight in terms of, what I might be doing that wasn't, appropriate to their sensibility of what I should be doing.
It's flying below radar. That's
exactly. Exactly.
So Twisted Roots, how old were you when that band started and when the record came out?
So I actually played in 3 different incarnations of Twisted Roots. I went to high school, 12th grade, with Maggie Eric, who ended up being the first singer in Twisted Roots, who sings on Pretend You What, the single. And that was with Pat Smear on guitar. And we, I'd say I was 17, so that puts it at 78.
Okay.
About then, that first incarnation. And we, as I said, the band went through, I got kicked out of the band 3 times, basically.
For good grades.
I've been kicked out of a lot of bands that I've been in. If they weren't my own bands, I wasn't, let's just say it wasn't usually because of my bass playing.
Okay. You really were good at having that facade.
Look, I went to practice. I showed up. I had my gear. I played the songs. I knew the parts, but but containing my, sort of inner self has always been a bit of a struggle. This is why I finally found out that I needed to express all of this, angst or emotion via writing songs, which took me some time to get there, So before I had that outlet, it was just me all over the place.
And describe what me all over the place looks like to someone in a band.
Well, at that time, it would probably be easier for someone who was in a band with me to describe it. But I think that I was, emotional. I was an unhappy teenager, who didn't have a big good home structure, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
So I felt vulnerable and anxious and upset a lot. And I probably, just leaked that, general angst, that teenage angst all over the people who were, that's one thing I learned by the one girl band that I tried to be in, which is that playing with guys, they tended to treat bands a little bit more like professionally. You show up, you do it. There isn't room for the sort of emotional and the outside stuff. You just do your business. And eventually that became something that was very attractive to me about, playing with men. But it took me some time to figure out how to be professional myself in that context.
Okay. So Pretend what, I guess, what was the decision, the conversation around, hey, let's do a single? What was the goal? What was the process? What was the structure coming up with that?
Well, in early punk rock days, the only music you heard at clubs, right, was the bands that had records. They'd play the Clash or the Sex Pistols or Blondie or whoever, the ones that had the records. And then and pretty early, A&M Records signed the Dickies and put out a single, and we thought, well, we've got it made now. Punk rock is going to get big and we're all going to get signed. And that's not what happened, but some small labels started to step up a little, that started to put out more CDs, singles. And I think it was a lot about, like I said, like there was no other way to be heard in the club. You couldn't always
yourself.
Be playing live. Yeah. I mean, you couldn't be playing live every night, right? So, but your record could get played at the clubs, just about every night if you got onto the rotation of the club's DJ or whatever, right? Because they did play music before the bands went on and stuff, even at the crummy little clubs in the punk rock days. So I think that's part of the goal, and the reasoning behind it was just this trying to be a real band. My brother was the boss, and frankly, bands are rarely democracies.
Mm-hmm.
It was his band, it was his songs. He was pretty much in charge. So it wasn't up to me. He got that arranged, the recording, and I showed up, and we had a lockout of a certain period of time, and we went to record, and we went home and left our stuff because we were going to come back the next day, and we got a bunch of stuff stolen out of that studio, as I remember, including my bass guitar, which is the last time I ever left my bass guitar at a studio. You might guess.
So Pretentia, what was on Tim Ferriss Records? Was Tim the guy that was kind of bankrolling the whole thing? Who was Tim Ferriss?
Tim Ferriss was, just a guy who was a fan and who, decided to support what we were doing. Mm-hmm. I don't know that he put out a lot of records. He was just a friend who wanted to help make it happen for us.
With the actual record itself, there's etchings in the run-out groove of that. Do you remember what those were?
I do not remember what those were. And again, it was probably not, one of the things about Tribute to Roots that was funny is basically I was at school and I, would go to school and then we'd practice, after school. And a lot was happening while I was in school. Those guys were for a little while, there was somebody making some negotiations about wanting extras for movies, and getting punkers. And so, they got to go do that. And I was at school, I missed a lot. Yeah. I went to school and then I went to practice and then I went to school and then I went to practice, that was, I was trying to hold that up. So no, I don't remember the etchings, but I believe you.
Okay, yeah. So I'll remind you what they are. Maybe they were an inside joke. Maybe.
Okay.
Who knows? I believe side A was Maggie says hi, suck my balls, and the other side is Ratso rules. Hey Barbara, lip hi Alexander.
Suck my balls was an expression Maggie used. I've certainly heard that coming out of her mouth. But no, it probably was just, look, we were young punkers and probably a certain amount of shock value and just, hey, we can put this on the record, but I wasn't part of the decision-making process on that.
That's something that happened while you were in social studies. Got it.
Right.
So Black Flag comes along. They're your favorite band. And as I understand, Henry is the guy who says, Kira, why don't you come along to a practice and jam with us? But Greg and Bill were somewhat unaware of his overages at that point. Is that correct?
We'll be back after these messages.
Hey there, do you know who just got a ton of used records up for sale? AudiofileUSA.com. They have over 42,000 titles in their online shop, all excellent and near mint condition. They do not screw around with records of mid-tier quality. Only the best vinyl makes it to AudiofileUSA.com. So you know that when you buy from them, all your records will be of supreme quality. AudiofileUSA.com is family-owned and operated, high-quality stock, and they love music, the exact type of businesses we love to support. Just point your browser to AudiofileUSA.com, search, dig, and find the gold. That's AudiofileUSA.com, home of the Holy Grails. Oh yeah, and don't forget to wash your record grooves with the Groove Washer, the #1 vinyl record cleaner in the world. Bring out the best sound for your vinyl experience by using the Groove Washer before each play. Ask for the Groove Washer by name at your local record shop and accept no substitutes. Or if you can't make it to the store, go to groovewasher.com and use discount code VinylGuide10 at checkout and save on everything you buy. Don't wait, your vinyl experience will be immediately uplifted by using the Groove Washer. That's groovewasher.com, discount code VinylGuide10. Go now!
Now we return to the program already in progress.
No limits. So Black Flag comes along. They're your favorite band. And as I understand, Henry is the guy who says, Kira, why don't you come along to a practice and jam with us? But Greg and Bill were somewhat unaware of his overages at that point. Is that correct?
I was playing with Des in a band called DC3. We had really just started, and I had this idea of a 3-piece, and we're playing with a drummer, me and Des, and we were practicing at the Black Flag practice pad, basically. And yeah, I got a call from Henry, and he said, Chuck was out, and did I want to play, and did I want to jam with Greg and Bill? And I said yeah, and he said you should just stay after practice and jam with them. And sure enough, they showed up after DC3 practice, and I said, so you guys want to jam? And they seemed surprised. which I thought was odd. I don't remember ever getting an explanation about that from Henry, but they said sure, and we jammed.
Was Chuck truly out at that point, or was it
as a bass player? Yes, he was still involved and did continue to book Black Flag, and his band SWA toured with us. So he wasn't absent, but as a bass player, he was no longer playing with them. Yeah.
Oh, okay, all right. They weren't figuring out a backup plan while Chuck was still in the band. Okay.
Oh, no. Okay. No.
So what happened first, touring or making a record?
So I joined in the fall of 1983, and they had already recorded My War. And so that was a done deal that was going to come out. And we started practicing and learning the songs from Slip It In and Family Man, and we ended up recording those before we left on tour. It takes time to schedule the tour, so the spring tour was being scheduled, and we practiced for a few months, and then we're into 1984, and we recorded. As we did a 48-hour lockout, basic tracks, 2 records, falling down every 4 hours to into a puddle, and then getting back up and recording some more, and recorded those 2 records before we left on the My War tour to support that record. And then we went to Europe right after the American leg of that tour.
After joining the band, was Greg open to your contributions to the music, or was the music written and you really had to work around what was already there?
Greg was the songwriter. Definitely, when I joined, he had a lot of material that he wanted to get done, and my sense was that what he wanted from me was to very specifically play the riffs that he was writing, and he would show me those riffs specifically, and my job was to hold that fort so that he could do whatever he wanted to, and the drums could. I mean, on some of the instrumentals, that's what I do, right? I play the riff over and over and over again, and everybody else goes hog-ass wild and comes back to visit once in a while, and I stay the course, So it was more of a physical challenge than a creative one during that time, but it felt like that's what he wanted and they wanted, so that's what I did.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel able to contribute? Did he take in some ideas sometimes, or was he pretty well set in his ways?
I didn't, when I joined the band, I was along for the ride somewhat. I was, like I said, I don't think of bands as a democracy. I didn't expect to be a contributor or a collaborator. I was at UCLA too. So again, I was going to school and coming back and practicing and going to school. And, so my plate was kind of full. I wasn't writing a lot of songs at that time. Mm-hmm. I had written songs in other bands before, but during that time, I just hunkered down and pretty much learned the songs and played them, and so I didn't test that if at any given time. I don't know. I don't feel that there was necessarily a resistance. I just didn't test that, and then at a certain point, I I don't know, Bill and I were practicing at one point, and I started just messing around, playing some songs a couple songs that I had written in Sex Sick, my girl band I was talking about, and eventually those two songs did get recorded by Black Flag with Henry writing some lyrics to them. But again, that was not ever sort of me trying to foist those into the band. It was almost like Bill and I were just messing around, and we started doing them because, again, we practiced for a lot of hours. So there was time to go through those songs and to jam. And so at one point he and I started doing those. We also did one of his songs, and Henry, wrote lyrics. And in some ways, I think some of that material that where Henry gets to write the lyrics is some of the best in some ways, because he's expressing his own feelings rather than, singing Greg's songs. So some of that is my favorite material, just because he gets to explore his own ideas.
Right. So for instance, songs like Slip It In and Black Coffee, those lyrics weren't necessarily Henry's. Those were Greg's.
Slip It In was definitely Greg. And Black Coffee was definitely Greg. My War is a Chuck song. So Chuck was one of the key songwriters of some of the best Black Flag songs. And I think in some ways, Chuck's lyrics reflect Henry's viewpoints more closely than Greg's. Some of his, Slip It In is a perfect example. That's not so much a Henry kind of mindset. That's a Greg mindset,
right.
The party, the women, the party, he had a little bit of that to say, whereas Henry's more expressing an inner turmoil and an inner angst that isn't, so doesn't always feel to me exactly enmeshed.
Yeah, it does feel like that song in particular seems to sit outside of what I think of when it comes to Black Flag music. Not necessarily a bad song, but just different, right?
A great bass line.
Yeah. So when you went into that 48-hour lockout to record what became 2 albums, did you guys already have in mind, well, these songs are going to go on one album, these songs are going to go on the other? Was there already that diversification?
Definitely. The Family Man was going to be an instrumental record, and that one song, then became one that he wrote lyrics to, but and later on that happened more times where him, basically when you practice for 5 hours a day, the singer can't sing for 5 hours a day, right? So there's going to be times when he's either not there or sitting down in the corner and we're playing, and that's when he started writing some lyrics to some of the stuff that we thought of as instrumental. And so we had been planning this instrumental stuff. That was part of Greg's interest, was to do instrumental music. And then so that was the intention, always to have a sort of traditional Black Flag record and an instrumental.
Okay. And then after the songs were recorded, you guys went on tour and everything. 1984 was a very, very busy year. Were you going to school in 1984 as well?
I went to the quarter at UCLA. That was the beginning of the year, and then we toured in spring and summer. We went to the U.S. and then Europe, and then I went to the fall quarter at UCLA, and then we toured in winter 1984, which was a nightmare and all my fault.
Yeah. So that year, I want to say 3 albums came out. 187 shows that year, plus you had 2 quarters of university. How were your grades? I
was a pretty solid B student. UCLA is a big school, and the computer major was very competitive. And, in those applied math classes, the A's were just not accessible to a lot of us. There was sort of like, those are the A students and the rest of us are fighting for the B's, and I was very happy if I could pull a B in those calculus and applied math classes that I was taking. I'm not a natural math person, so it was just a slog the whole way. And adding, really loud music to the whole thing did not assist me in thinking, clearly and doing that. So I muddled through UCLA with B's, but I did, I graduated.
Oh, I'm impressed. B's even. That's well done, especially for that field. So after you recorded all those songs, you guys went out on tour. Obviously, you had classes, you had, a lot of other things to do. Did you have much involvement in terms of artwork coming in or putting together the assembly of the records or the pressing, or did you just see them when it was all done? And
no, I mean, it wasn't a secret, but I wasn't a decision maker. About the only thing I got involved with while we would be, sort of at the office, while I was spending time at the office, not being in school or in the rehearsal room, was I got involved in the only thing I thought would be, I'd be able to contribute in, which is answering some of the mail that came in. That was something that was, just a task that I could help with. So, that was a pretty full schedule,
Okay. So that's people, sending in letters to the band or $20 for a couple records, that sort of thing?
Fan letters, that kind of thing. There was, it was just, like I said, a set of work that I could help with. And I was, diligent in trying to contribute without wanting to, become a decision maker, or, I wasn't going to help book the tours. I wasn't going to make decisions about the records per se, but that was something I could just help with some of the lifting of, because there was a certain amount of mail coming in, and that had to be processed, because, you didn't want to let that pile up, and we weren't always in Los Angeles, so it had to be, processed while we were home. But for the most part, I was probably studying and practicing and going to school and sleeping.
Now, I see pictures of those early tours, and everyone just looks so tired, so disheveled. Was touring with Black Flag, was it what you expected going into it?
Well, I did know, I knew intellectually what I was getting into, but did I know physically what I was getting into? I think it's hard to imagine until you're up against, being, that playing those physical of shows, getting that little sleep, having access to those few showers, all of that. Like, the whole picture was probably a little tricky to wrap my head around until it was actually happening. Like I said, it's hard to imagine until you're actually there. I was early on in Black Flag, I was struggling a lot with my right hand, which was in pain a lot of the time. It's funny, I'm left-handed, and I play the bass guitar right-handed, and stupid me, when I started, I thought, cool, my left hand, my good hand is where the hard part is. And then I joined a band with a drummer and I found out, no, there's a reason. And the right hand is, that hand, that plucking hand, should be your strongest. I would always recommend a left-handed player play properly, but by the time I really came face to face with that, my my right hand was not no longer functioning in such a way that I could have switched. Right. I did a certain amount of chewing up the right hand during early days, trying to get play hard and fast like that. So that was one of the factors, was fighting with my right hand. And it's funny, I've seen pictures of me backstage after a show, sort of burying my head, and I'm not upset, I'm just in pain. And between the set and the encore, I just had to sort of hold on to play the encore, and then my hand would go into a bucket of ice.
Wow.
So, but if I put it in the bucket of ice before the encore, I wouldn't be able to move. It would be solid and unmoving. So so the big struggles were that just physically being able to play the 2 hour set. I blew a lot of speakers on the first tour. We didn't really have, the setup wasn't really good enough for what for the amount of power I was trying to push through it, because I couldn't always hear myself. I mean, the drums were hugely loud and the guitar is really loud, right? And so all of this sort of mechanics of doing it, I was struggling with. And then you can't ever get sleep. You have to get to the next show, and so by the time you get to someone's floor and sleep for a few hours, I mean, we were asleep literally, like, hey, anybody got a place to stay at the end of the gig, and then go and then sleep for a few hours and then have to get up and drive to the next town. A lot of the times, until you get to the East Coast where the towns are a little closer together, you got big drives too.
Inside the van, did you guys have to take merch? Did you take any merch? Did you take records with you? Any of that? Did you have a little table set up to help sell stuff for the band?
The first tour, we didn't carry as much stuff because we ended up having to switch from a small school bus, which burned up very early, jump into Chuck's van. And so we really just had the gear, and so we were very minimal. But after that, for a lot of reasons, we started bringing our own PA system, because there were so many towns you'd pull in and there'd be some hall, and there'd be these tiny little speakers, of a PA system. And it was like, you weren't going to be able to hear Henry over our amps and the drums, and there'd be this big hall, and so to us that it was such a important thing that we actually be able to sound, the way we needed to sound. So we started traveling with our own PA system, which meant a rider truck hauling gear. And then we had, of course, extra space. So we started having merch with us, and a merch table and a merch guy from then on for all the tours after that first tour.
How solid were the set lists? Did they change night after night? Did they change on stage? Or did you kind of already have a structure that we kind of know we're going to start with this and end with this, but what happens in the middle, we'll work it out?
No, there was a set that we would tend to fall into a set, which was a mixture of a few classic old songs, and then the record that we were promoting, and maybe a couple of new things we were working on. And we would tend to play a very similar set from night to night, because it lends itself to us just getting tighter and tighter and more, able to dig into it, because it's a somewhat defined thing. So it was pretty pre-calculated and relatively static during the course of any given tour.
And what do you recall about the recording of Who's Got the 10.5? Did you guys approach it any differently? Was there anything happening special leading up to it, or was it just another gig?
We were on tour. It was literally just, we pulled into the town, and they had arranged to have a mobile recording unit, a 24-track mobile recording truck, pull up to the club and record us. So from my standpoint, it was absolutely just another show. I didn't have to do anything special.
But you knew that night things were going to be a little bit more permanent than other nights. You knew that it was going to be.
We did, but like I said, once you've been on tour for a couple of weeks doing the same basic structure, you turn into just a machine. It's kind of amazing what happens to a band on tour. It turns into something which is pretty indestructible. You would have to literally pull the plug on the PA system or do something pretty radical to stop us. We would just start and bowl over right through. Nothing could stop us and or shake us, and by the time we did that show, we had done a full, that was a 4-month tour. So we had been out for a long time. So there was no skittishness or concern about playing a set. It was a set we knew we could play, and we knew were ready. Confidence is key when playing live.
Did the Black Flag touring experience, did that grow your confidence? What did that contribute to you as an individual?
Well, I got a lot stronger physically, and it may sound weird, but I mean, the bass and the drums especially are very physical instruments, and I didn't necessarily get that until I had really, sort of upped the ante in that regard, and I was able to sort of get to where I could manhandle the bass, this piece of wood, a little bit more completely. And so I would say that one of the big things was I just got a lot stronger. I know it's funny. I remember clearly doing a Twisted Roots practice, some kind of incarnation of Twisted Roots after I had been in Black Flag, and Paul commenting about how much better my playing was. And, I was playing similar Twisted Roots stuff. So yeah, I mean, I was a stronger player for sure, having been in Black Flag. But again, it was not a particularly creative time. So it wasn't a time where I, necessarily became a more broad bass player or a more creative songwriter. It was just the physical exercise and an experience that helped me understand touring bands.
So coming back off that tour, you guys get started on Loose Nut. That seemed to be a time that really the rift between Raymond and Greg started over the artwork, as I understand. Was that your observation?
Again, I was not privy to that as much. I know now after the fact more in the sense that, take a look at Raymond's art. It is not colored, so the simple choice to start, designing, color into his art is a pretty, inconsiderate choice, really. Now in hindsight, I got to know Raymond probably a lot better after I was in Black Flag, because he and my ex-husband Mike are very close friends, and so we spent a certain amount of time with him, and they're both just very strong personalities, and something like that, making a choice like colorizing the artwork in a way that he didn't approve is a pretty extreme decision, which obviously did create some tension between them. But I wasn't that aware of it. Again, probably going to school and studying. I was not always privy to everything that was happening sort of in the politics of the band. I was involved heavily in the music, obviously, and then I had my own cross to bear or something.
Yeah, look, Greg always seems to be maligned in the history of the band, and it's strange. He's the founder. He's the one consistent member. Do you feel that perception is deserved? Do you think he's misunderstood? What are your thoughts on Greg's?
Well, he's the founder, and he's also the one who's kicked every member out. And the reason there's been so many people who've come and gone out of Black Flag. So just like I was describing with myself being, perhaps, difficult, and a personality that didn't always work well with others. Clearly, Greg struggled with working well with others, and his solution was often to just fire people. And myself included, so that doesn't make him a bad person, and I don't perceive him to be a bad person, but he does, he has personality quirks like we all do, and he tends to consider his position to be the one and only position, and being the founding member and decision maker, he can do things like throw Chuck, his best friend, out of the band, or Bill, or any of the other people, including myself, out of the band. So that's, is it deserved? The probably more complicated aspect of it all is him being in charge of the record label, and therefore in being in charge of whether or not anyone were to receive royalties for their work, just adds to that complexity. And I always sort of saw it as he wasn't a great businessman, and he was running this business. He's a guitar player, he's an artist, so. But that, when anything comes to money, it's a pretty, you're hitting people right where they live or don't live, as the case may be, so again, it's perfectly understandable that people would feel slighted and angry about it all. And yet I don't know how much of it was, calculated on his part, and how much of it was just really, not very sound business practices. We all have our opinions of how he should have conducted things, but you know what? I think having strong feelings about how someone else should conduct their life is something I should keep to myself.
Right.
So I try to stay out of the Greg bashing thing. I understand it, and I am very close to some of the people who are the most vocal about his behaviors, but I try not to be that vocal about how I think he should have behaved.
Now, Black Flag was your favorite band going into it. You became part of Black Flag. What's happened to Black Flag in recent years? What is your opinion on that?
I thought it was great that that the guys created Flag, and these days it's fascinating that punk rock is so hip now, right? And so although from my own standpoint, the concept of rehashing old stuff is not that exciting to me, I was thrilled to see them getting some recognition after, slogging through $10 a day per diems, for years and years and years, and living on floors and in vans and stuff. So there's a part of me who's thrilled to see, those guys getting the recognition that they have always deserved. And Greg's decision to say, hey, Black Flag is my thing, and I'm going to do a version of it to, whether or not that was in response to, or just he would have done it anyway, who knows? But that's no surprise. He's been creating iterations of Black Flag for a long time, and he's still doing it. So, more power to him. So, there's a part of me that, like I said, feels good about the fact that that people who never got to see it, get to see some incarnation of it. That's a cool thing. And they play big arenas and stuff now. So, I mean, I'm happy for them. It's not necessarily something I would want to do anyway, but I'm glad that they're doing it, and I support their opportunity to play for people, and that for people to go see it and enjoy it,
Since you've left the band, have you had any or much communication with Greg or SST HQ?
A little bit, but not for a long time. I went to the first Flag show in Redondo Beach. They played, and I heard about it, and I went. And a lot of that was because I don't see those guys very often, and so it was a chance to see Bill and Chuck and look them in the eye and say hey and see them do the thing. Henry and I have had interactions on and off during the last 30 years. Dose did a benefit one time for him, and I got an email from him saying, hey, I heard you got an Oscar. And I said, no, I was on the team that won the Oscar, because that that was this announcement that came out and had to be corrected. But so occasionally when need be or something comes up, I'll email with him. I did an interview with Dave Grohl for his sort of van touring documentary that he did, and he was asking for pictures of us from the van days, and I contacted Henry to see if we had any pictures that might not be out there, and if something comes up, there's a cordial relationship there, but it's not necessarily a friendship. It's just old colleagues.
Yeah. Tell me about Minute Flag, a collaboration between Black Flag and Minutemen. Going into it, as I understand it, you guys recorded this material, but then it was agreed not to be released until at least one of the bands broke up. Is that correct?
Again, I was not a decision maker in this, but that was just another one of those lockouts. We had a lockout to record a bunch of music, and that was going to be some of it. And those guys showed up and set up, and we recorded the stuff that we had planned to do, one structured song and some jams, and we recorded it. And my feeling was always, it didn't capture really what we were trying to do. It didn't come out quite as everybody had hoped, maybe. And so there wasn't the enthusiasm to say, hey, let's get this out there. But I wasn't part of the decision making. It was my first and lasting realization that the only way to do a 2-bass band is to have no other people in the band. Especially with Mike Watt, because after all, as a bass player, he's a pretty present individual. So, you're not going to get any space unless you have all the rest of it.
Yeah, it must be interesting, especially with Dos and your partnership with Mike. The songwriting, was it difficult, just even finding the space to express yourself in between his notes?
Yeah, it's all about the songwriting in Dos and in the 2-bass music that I do now and have done, for the last 30 years. So it originally started actually with, I was moving to Connecticut after I was out of Black Flag and finished UCLA. I was going to try to get a job, and it was difficult to get a computer job with no experience. Everybody wanted experience. So actually my father had started the computer department at Yale when I was a little kid, and hired the guy who was running it. So I moved to New Haven because he offered me my first job, and sort of, willingly said, hey, if you want to come for a year, get some experience, and then leave. So I always intended to just go and work for a year and come back. So because I was leaving, I was worried that my very young nephews would forget me. So I started to record bedtime stories and record my bass and do 2 intertwining basses, because I thought it was a very warm, soothing type instrument. And that I have one nephew who would lie awake at night when I babysat, and I thought, well, they could listen to these cassettes and hear my voice and maybe remember me, and I would do these, elaborate. I mean, I did this for years. I did it all the way from Dr. Seuss when they were very young to Edgar Allan Poe as they got older, so they would get more and more sophisticated. And the music I tried to write to support the story. And so anyway, I got into this whole 2-bass thing back then. And when Mike and I first started playing, we used some of those things that I had written as some of the early Dos material. But so I had started this figuring out how to intertwine basses thing. And if you're writing it, one of the bass lines has to start. So in Dos, a lot of times, the way it seemed to always work somehow is if it was his song, he would write the initial bass line, and then I would write something to it, and he would tweak it, and then, we would have a song. But if it was my song, I tended to write the second bass line, the first and second bass line, and then he would learn it or modify it slightly. Mm-hmm. So it always seemed like there weren't a lot of songs which he wrote from scratch the bass lines to mine. But because of that, because of the sort of different styles of writing, I think it made for more varied kind of songs. I think Mike's songs are quite different than my songs in Dose. But I did get and feel like I have gotten pretty well versed in how to find the spaces and create the spaces and holes. And Mike, as we did Dose more, got better at the holes and the spaces. And it's become a big part of how I see my style, if you will, is to find spaces, to create spaces. And if you hand me a straight rock song and tell me to write a bass line, I won't write a straight bass line that you might have been expecting. I'm going to find some spaces. I'm going to, it's become a little bit of my way to not do the obvious thing. So with two basses, you do have to work. You're both in the same frequency range. You have to do more to work around each other than you might if you had a melodic instrument that was a little higher pitch that would stay out of the space of the bass. So that is the challenge, is to intertwine the basses in a way that is pleasant, hopefully.
And listening to this new album, and I can tell it's a very bass-led album, unsurprisingly. How do you now approach your songwriting with all the history you've had and the various experiences you've had? I'm assuming you start with the bass line. Do you start with the idea, with the vocal? Where do you begin, and how do you know how to sculpt the song?
It usually starts with some sort of idea or word or phrase or emotion, and oftentimes with then the bass trying, me playing the bass, trying to capture that phrase, emotion, or whatever musically. Occasionally, I might write some lyrics or some words in a vacuum, and then write the bass line. The words will always get reformatted because I do think rhythmically. So even when I'm working on the vocal melody, I'm going to change the words that I might have down on the page in order to fit to the bass line once I have that. So the bass line is what's going to create, the first bass line is going to create some kind of structure for then the voice to work within. And then most of the time another bass gets added. And then, then it varies. I have my dear friend Glenn that I played with all those years ago lives in Ohio, and we've been doing virtual music, sending things back and forth forever. And he has added some beautiful, tasty guitars on this record. And I have a drummer who lives in town here, a friend who I've never played with in the same room, who adds amazingly delicate drums. He finds the spaces. He finds a way to be a drummer without just slathering drums all over it. It's kind of amazing to me. I'm not sure there's any other drummers out there who could do it now, but he seems to really have a knack for it. And then sometimes I'll just go to Kitten Robot and work with my brother Paul, and we'll add some things there. And on this particular record, I also was able to invite my friend Petra Hayden to do some amazing vocals and violin. So each song kind of takes a life of its own after the initial spark of an idea, but the bass creates the foundation. And in that way, it's very much like a Dose song. It has to start with that first bass, and everything else sort of gets affected by that. That's my first. I mean, I've been a bass player longer than I've been a woman. It's just a part of me. It's how I express myself. So that is the primary tool.
Were these songs that have been around for years and you've been working on them for some time, or were they a product of like the last 12, 24 months?
It is actually a story that is somewhat chronological, and the first song was written about 13 years ago. So it does track this sort of chronology, but yes, very much been in the works for years. I mean, I've been working on songs in my room and recording stuff forever. There's a lot of other songs that aren't part of this record, and this just happened to be a body of work that when Kitten Robot offered to put a record out, and here I was at 60 years old, it seemed like a perfect time to put my first solo record out. This was the set of songs that I felt hung together as a story, and so it just made sense to put these particular songs. But at any given time in my life, there's a set of maybe 20 songs that are in some state of completion, from just their infancy to farther along at Kitten Robot, mixing and doing more polishing work. And that's been true for a long time. I never really intended to release this stuff. It's just been the way I work. I express myself into the music, and I'm fine with that just being the end of it. But they offered, so I said, sure, I'll do this thing.
Kira, thank you very much for sharing those stories. I do want to draw people's attention to Kira's first solo album. It's available on October 19th on Kitten Robot Records. You can go to kittenrobot.com. You could probably start pre-ordering right now. Hopefully we'll see a vinyl version on that as well. And Kira, we really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing those stories, and we look forward to seeing your continued projects and output and trajectory and good spirits.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, there we go. Kira Roessler, what a delightful individual. Great conversation. I really enjoyed hearing those stories and having her here on the show. Again, her solo album can be had at Kitten Robot Records. That's kittenrobot.com. It's available October 19th, I believe, but you could pre-order now. No need to delay. kittenrobot.com. And that's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please share these episodes on your social media. Put them out on Facebook, tweet them out on Twitter. Leave us a positive review in iTunes. That always helps. And we'll be back shortly with a brand new episode. So until we talk next time, get out there and buy some records, people. Cheers.
That's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Send your thoughts to Nate at thevinylguide.com or follow or tag us on Instagram at Vinyl Guide. Until next time, keep spinning.